one way to increase trade with other countries would be with a pipeline to British Columbia's west coast. But the Liberals killed Northern Gateway in 2016, resulting in billions in lost opportunities for Canadian workers and businesses.
This government was elected to deliver nation-building projects. The federal government has been engaged in constructive talks with the government of Alberta, and we will have more to say in a few weeks.
While the Liberals have made it illegal for Canadian companies to load Canadian ships with Canadian oil, U.S. tankers can continue to travel off BC's coast and take their oil to countries around the world.
The Premier of Alberta has said she's quite supportive of what we're doing and is looking forward to finishing the conversations with the Prime Minister.
Debate in the House of Commons on a possible deal between Alberta and Ottawa to get a pipeline to BC Tidewater. The feds and province are negotiating a so-called memorandum of understanding on energy policy that could make the project viable. Sources in both governments say the MOU could be announced any day and would include a deal on the industrial price on carbon that could make the Pathways carbon capture project more economical and pave the way for that pipeline, along with a carve-out to the tanker ban potentially along BC's coast. Here's Alberta Premier Danielle Smith first on the state of negotiations.
We're working on it. Still very hopeful. I was hopeful before the Grey Cup, which was one of the deadlines he'd set for new major projects. We know that we've got a little bit more work to do on the technical side to be able to submit our pipeline proposal for consideration to the Major Projects Office. We've targeted the spring on that. And if we do get to an agreement with the federal government, we'll certainly let you know. And but I remain very hopeful as our negotiations continue.
This afternoon, BC's Premier David Eby released a statement that reads in part, "These talks about eliminating the ban on oil tankers off our coast have taken place without anyone from British Columbia at the table. Like many British Columbians," the statement goes on to say, "I learned of these talks through a news article. Real jobs and prosperity are put at risk from this extremely early stage and unfunded proposal of a heavy oil pipeline. That's something that BC and Canada cannot afford at this time." Now, we're going to be speaking with the Premier Eby, I should say, in just about 10 minutes. First, though, let's set the stage with our front bench. Marco Mendicino is here. He's former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and a former Liberal cabinet minister. He's now a senior counsel and strategic advisor for Castles. CTV political analyst and former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is with us. He's now a policy advisor at Edelman. And Peter Julian is a former longtime NDP MP and House Leader. Hello to all three of you. Thanks so much for making the time for the conversation. Marco, I'll start with you. BC's statement, the Premier's statement, certainly adds another layer of complexity to all this. What do you think is really going on?
Well, I think Premier Eby is expressing some anxiety around the potential for a memorandum of understanding, which has been reported in the press as being imminent between Canada and Alberta. You know, I think it's important that we listen to him and to all premiers. And I think on the other side of the ledger, it is remarkable that Premier Danielle Smith has changed both the tone and the substance of her dialogue. And it seems that we are on the cusp of seeing a new level, perhaps an unprecedented level, of collaboration between Ottawa and Alberta when it comes to energy. So I would just conclude by saying I don't think that it is a necessary precondition that BC and Alberta, or any province for that matter, agree on every mile of how we develop energy projects. But I do think that there is broad alignment when it comes to creating jobs. I do believe that there is broad alignment when it comes to addressing climate. I do believe that there's broad alignment when it comes to working closely with First Nations. And that is has to be the bedrock on which we drive forward, because we need to get our energy to market. And everything the government has done, whether it's major projects or some of these bilateral relationships and agreements that we're negotiating, has to be geared towards that.
The idea, though, of some sort of bilateral agreement between the federal government and Alberta, James, substantively, we don't know for sure what's in it, but all of what's being reported is not being denied at this point by either side. Symbolically, what do you think it says?
Well, the package of clips that you played in the introduction to this conversation, I think, was interesting because everybody had a point. Danielle Smith says we have a valuable commodity that the rest of the world wants, and she's right, and it's extraordinarily valuable to all Canadians to get it to those markets. Andrew Scheer said we need to diversify our trade away from the United States, and he's right. This is a commodity that we should get to other markets, so we're not have 97% of our oil exports just going to the United States. Minister Hodgson said, have some patience. We're working with the province of Alberta, and we'll have something to announce in a little while. And be patient. He's right. We should be. If they have some rapprochement and some engagement, we should have open minds about a good faith agreement that seems to be about to be mentioned. And then finally, Premier Eby said, where's the British Columbia voice at this? And he's right. Premier Eby makes a very important point. That picture of Danielle Smith from Alberta and the Prime Minister of Canada, who's from Alberta, who represents an Ottawa riding, Minister Hodgson, who's from Toronto, and Andrew Scheer, who's from Saskatchewan, all having these robust debates about a very important piece of infrastructure that's going to go through British Columbia and cut right through Indigenous territory. British Columbia has a voice. And by the way, Premier Eby is an important voice in this, but he doesn't speak for all British Columbians. And British Columbia does not seem to be at the table in all of this. And this is going to be a massive project, conceivably, of enormous environmental, economic, and political consequence for British Columbia, and our voice hasn't been heard as British Columbians.
At this point, Peter, we don't have any of the, we have, like I said, substantively a lot is out there in reporting that isn't being denied, but we don't actually have the document in front of us. Why do you think even at this stage, or even when it was being speculated a number of weeks ago by the Premier in Alberta, why do you think it's led to the reaction it has with Premier Eby?
Well, I think it's very concerning that these discussions have been basically taking place behind BC's back. I was at the BC NDP convention last weekend. There's a broad consensus around the North Coast tanker ban for very obvious reasons. So it's not just environmental. It's also the economic impacts. We're talking about thousands of jobs in the fisheries, tens of thousands of jobs in tourism that could be at risk if we reopen the North Coast to tanker traffic. And so the fact that this is happening, that the Carney government is negotiating with the Alberta Conservative government is very concerning. British Columbia hasn't been at the table, and BC has very, very legitimate reasons for saying no. There's a broad consensus around this issue. As I say, both environmental and economic impacts. It's surprising to me that the Carney government would disregard what is a very, very strong public opinion in British Columbia around this issue.
I should point out, we did ask for the federal government to come and respond. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say, as a fellow British Columbian, Peter makes some important points there, right? And I agree with him about the British Columbia voice not being heard. But if you look at public opinion polls, Peter, as you know, British Columbians are divided on this. There's not an absolute public opinion majority against all this. And tanker traffic does exist along that corridor. It just happens to be Americans who are going along that corridor. And, the idea that, there's a tanker ban or there's no tanker ban, there is such thing as a middle ground. There's such thing as having tankers go in and out of those waters in a way that is judicious and responsible, that has world-class technology, that it keeps our waters and our environment safe, is done in a responsible way. We know that can happen because it's already happening with American tankers going right across our shoreline. So it can be done. The question is, I think to your point, Peter, is that there is a political price to pay, and there is a conversation that needs to be had. And the question is Mark Carney prepared to spend some of his political capital in order to do a nation-building project that would be good for all Canadians? That's up to him to show that leadership. And, we're in a wait-and-see moment.
Well, the Trans Mountain Pipeline
ascertain. Yeah, well, one moment. I'll get to you both in one second. I just want to be clear. From what I can ascertain, other tankers can go through it, but they can't. You cannot dock somewhere and basically load up or unload oil, which is effectively what renders a new pipeline impossible at this point. So there is like a salient difference about what exists right now, in if it were to be a carve out, I guess, per se. Peter, I'll get to you, and then I'll go to you first, and then Marco. Like, what change that would entail? Peter, what did you were just about to say something?
Well, but just the other point, of course, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline is under capacity. This was paid for tens of billions of dollars in public funds, a huge public subsidy, and so it's a bit disingenuous for folks in Alberta to say, well, let's have another pipeline. Let's throw away the North Coast tanker ban. Let's run roughshod over Indigenous rights and Indigenous Indigenous peoples have been very clear about maintaining the North Coast tanker ban. And so to do all that when you have a hugely publicly subsidized pipeline that is running under capacity, that makes no sense at all. And this is why the Carney government negotiating behind BC's back, it's very concerning to me that these kinds of actions are taking place.
Two quick things out of that, Marco, for you. The first is on TMX. It's a lot closer to capacity than it used to be. I actually went out to the terminal to see like the process of loading them up and all that stuff. The big picture from TMX right now, which BC has officially actually endorsed, is increasing its capacity, because if you optimize that pipeline, they think you can add something like 350,000 barrels. The argument for from BC right now is, let's do that. And basically not do the other thing. On the point that Peter makes around like BC not essentially being at the table, that is to me the biggest head scratcher at this point, because it doesn't seem to align with the kind of rhetoric that we've heard from the Prime Minister and the federal government in the previous months. Do you think that there's been no outreach to BC? Like, does that seem feasible to you? And if it is, do you think that's a mistake?
Well, I think it is very likely, and in fact on the record, that the Prime Minister has had wide-ranging discussions with all premiers about energy, both bilaterally and multilaterally at First Ministers' meetings, and I'm quite confident that he will continue that conversation with Premier Eby in the context of many of these initiatives that we're discussing, including a potential MOU with Alberta, given that it straddles those provincial boundaries. But I want to say a couple of things in response to the points that my friend Peter has made. One is, having just spent time in both Vancouver and Calgary earlier this week, I think we should begin with the prima facie assumption that premiers who are speaking on behalf of their people are doing so in good faith, and that Premier Eby is quite proud to champion LNG projects that have been supported by the federal government. And I think at the same time, Premier Smith is putting forward what she believes in her best assessment and opinion are projects that will allow us to become an energy superpower, and that is the objective here. Let's be clear about that we want to get more of our energy to market, and that we have been historically held back by duplicative regulation and too much red tape, and the Major Projects Office is all about cutting through that so that we can achieve that goal. And the second thing is that, look, I'll come back to what I said at the outset. There's not always going to be 100% agreement on every single mile of how we get the energy to market. But what is important is that we work together collaboratively. And there may very well be lessons that could be learned from the way in which Premier Eby has worked with First Nations to get their energy to market through LNG that can be championed elsewhere, including in Alberta. And I just think that we need to go from gridlock to green light when it comes to these energy projects. The one thing I hear right across industry leadership is we're being held back. And we need to really unshackle ourselves and do it in a way that is consistent with all of the objectives and the criteria that are in the major projects legislation.
And I do understand the sentiment, James. And I think, look, for months, premiers were talking in the same way, being very collaborative. But this proposition and the way it's unfolded, for whatever reason, has generated a very different type of response, in particular from Premier Eby. And you're right that, public opinion polls does show a majority of support for a pipeline, but he's in a pretty strong position after last week's convention, and he is the premier of the province. And if you look at that number based on party, it isn't the case for NDP supporters.
Yeah, and look, there's politics being played in this in British Columbia as well. Look, I don't think David Eby is insincere in his position. I'm not suggesting that, but the official opposition Conservatives in the province of British Columbia are in rough, bad, not good shape. And the political polls in British Columbia suggest that David Eby could probably win a majority if he went into an election campaign. And the right in British Columbia on the ground politically are divided, and there's this political party, One BC, that is extraordinarily toxic when it comes to Aboriginal and Indigenous issues. And I think there's an opportunity here for David Eby to be, frankly, to come in and say that this nonsense has to stop and Indigenous voices need to be heard. And I actually think that would be a very interesting and tough political environment for anybody to say that what's happened has not been really toxic. So I think there's politics on this in that regard. And yeah, he comes out of his party convention in a good position, also because he wants to appeal to Green Party voters, because the Green Party has also collapsed in British Columbia. That being said, though, that's the politics of it. It's a political show. That's the politics of it. But in terms of statecraft and the importance of a prime minister, British Columbia is the third largest and fastest growing province in Canada. And northern British Columbia, I can tell you as somebody who lived in the north, northern British Columbia feels completely cut out of this, and Indigenous voices in the north feel completely left out of this. It's true that Justin Trudeau canceled the Northern Gateway pipeline, but it collapsed in its public support because the way in which Enbridge, the company, did not engage as a company, and frankly, our government didn't do everything that we could to bring in Indigenous voices to make them feel part of the process. Northern British Columbians and Indigenous coastal First Nations, they're not just another stakeholder to deal with. They're people who feel that they own this land and they have an obligation to this land from over 10,000 years of hereditary history in that part of the country, and they can't just be bought off, and their voices need to be heard, and so far they've been completely shut out.
Last word to you, Peter. I feel like there's something in there that you probably agree with.
I sometimes agree with my colleague James. I think the reality is the Harper government tried to ram things through. It failed. The Carney government undertaking the same kind of lack of consultation and having a negotiation behind the back of the BC NDP government, I find that very disconcerting. And it's certainly not what Mr. Carney promised when he ran in the federal election in the spring. He talked about consultation. He talked about a different approach in government. We're not seeing that. We're seeing an approach that is very similar to the Stephen Harper government in terms of the things that take place behind closed doors.
Okay, I will just really quickly say before I take a break that we did reach out to Minister LeBlanc's office to see if they had a comment on Premier Eby's statement about being sort of left out of the meetings, and his office have told us that they will not be providing a comment.